context of white supremacy. Gus T. Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information with non-white people, victims of white supremacy. Today's date, Wednesday, May 21, 2025. So I have been told, as I said, schedule has been totally destroyed for the month of May as Gus T continues with the 51st annual Seattle International Film Festival, closing on the end of the festivities. I've seen lots of films, almost all of them, and I mean, it doesn't matter where in the known universe, but they have all been dominated by the system of white supremacy racism. We'll have more on that to come. But just like last year, Gus T paused in the middle of the film festival to attend an event also about racism at the University of Washington. Last year, they had the health symposium at the Hans Rosling Population Center. It was an all-day event, and I went and attended on Saturday. It was the Saturday before the festival concluded. I attended, asked questions, workshops, all that good stuff, and again, it was all about racism and health. This year, it wasn't an all-day event, but it caught my eye, I think either at the beginning of this month or very end of April, because it was promoted well in advance. The University of Washington's own Golden M. Owens gave her talk, Evolutions of Domestic Labor, Service Performing Devices in United States Homes and Lived Spaces. Now, I'm just going to give you what the description says as I read it. In this workshop, Golden M. Owens, lovely black female, victim of white supremacy, will discuss how the late 19th, early 20th century introduction and promotion of labor-saving products and technologies influenced and altered popular perceptions and articulations of domestic work and domestic workers, examining how this work, once largely performed by black women, came to be performed by or with the aid of labor-performing technologies. Owens connects this history of labor-saving devices to the present proliferation of artificially intelligent virtual assistants such as Apple's Siri, Amazon's Alexa, and ChatGPT. Now, I thought this would be, fascinating talk. She's talking a little bit about her book that's slated to be released, I think sometime next year, she said. You have some time for that. But I thought it would be interesting, and it was. However, for me, the glaring theme, as usual, and at this point, it is a conclusion. This is not a one-time thing or a kind of an iffy feeling. This is over and over and over and over. The University of Washington is willfully, deliberately anti-black male, and I mean every time. They rarely have black males enroll in the university. Like, we don't want no whole lot of Negro students here. They rarely have black male faculty in any department unless they're cleaning the toilet. And when they discuss racism, white supremacy, especially black people, almost invariably it is black females exclusively. In fact, I can pick out the most important. I could pick out a lot, but I'm going to pick that health symposium because health is supposed to be for everybody. Don't we want everybody to be healthy? Don't you want healthy uncles? Don't you want healthy dads? Don't you want healthy sons along with healthy moms, healthy sisters, right? Wrong. We don't want no healthy Leroy. Get on out of here, Leroy. But I said at that healthcare symposium last year, they had a whole panel that was supposed to address racism. The panel had, I think, about a dozen people. They had one non-white male. One on a panel of 12. Everybody else, whole mountain of black females. Non-white females, but they had a lot of black females, but mountain of non-white females. And I said, am I the only one with eyeballs that can see? You all are supposed to have a health. Is this a, I even asked, is it a woman's health conference? If it is, I will get my hind parts up and get the step. And they said, no. It's an everybody health conference. I said, well, why isn't that reflected in the staff? And they said, we know. They didn't say, golly gosh, we didn't know we didn't have no male representation. We didn't know we didn't pick nothing. I mean, nothing. Not one workshop geared towards black male health needs. They had reproductive health and all this. They had transgender workshops. Nothing about black male health. And I said, do they have black male students enrolled in the Department of Health? And they said, ooh, I think two. Willfully, aggressively anti-black. And I saw that even with this talk. In fact, I give you another one. I saw N.D.B. Conley. Tremendous book, author of A World More Concrete. But he spoke in the exact same building, not the same room because we were on a different floor, same building at the University of Washington last month. He did the same thing. Now, he did include black males in his talk, but he focused on an upcoming book where it focuses on the black females of his family. And he even had an important moment in that talk where he said, man, I'm there, and all these females, which I had noted phenotypically, they are very pale. You can see the influence of the raping, fondling white forefathers, right? He says you got these pale black females, and then you see my dark behind, and that's what he said, which is what I was thinking, like it's super female dominated, which is generally the case. And then he, the one male there, it was like two males maybe in the picture, big family portrait, they are significantly darker. Like, what is that experience? Black kid back? Anyway, but that was last month. Then, like I said, they do this all the time. I've literally heard people at University of Washington lectures say, that's the way to study slavery, is through the black female body. Leroy wasn't a slave. Medical apartheid, we didn't learn nothing about no black males being experimented on. Sam. I've heard this over and over and over. And then, like I said, it is manifest in who they have speak, who they have teach, who is enrolled. Just go count the number of Leroy students that are on campus, health studies or otherwise. Anyway, so they gave this talk, and it did bother me greatly. Like, they don't have black male laborers, especially in the 19th and 20th century. You didn't have no black male laborers then? Domestic laborers? Really? Woo! Consistent. In fact, in this talk, as you'll hear with the questions, they even moved to including Asians in the discussion, and there was no, we got to restrict it to female Asians or male. We talk about Asian labor, but no discussion of black male. And I was the only black male participant. They barely had any black people present other than Professor Owens, and then I think it was maybe one or two other black females total in a room of about 30 people. Maybe, I'm going to say it was total of 4 of us, and that's including the speaker, myself, and the 2 other spectators. But content that is greatly focused on black females and with a total exclusion of black males. I don't think you get an accurate I don't think you get a complete, I'll put it, you do not get an accurate understanding of white supremacy racism if you're just going to focus on one subject. I don't do that here at the C.O.W.S. We study it all. They don't do that at the University of Washington and many other academic locations. It's just going to be focused on one. Now, that importantly, there's a lot of important data in this 90-minute talk relating it to AI, and even some of the ways that the AI and ChatGPT, Alexa, how they are marketed, with the also exclusion of black people in some of these commercials, even though it would be ignoring slavery and the connection to Alexa and making life easy. We depend on our Negras to make life easy and not be other technology to make life easy. This talk reminded me greatly of Dr. Martin Kevorkian, admitted white supremacist who's been a guest on this program many, many times over the years. His book, Color Monitors, the Black Face of Technology in America. In fact, it reminded me so much of his talk, and we've talked about some of these similar themes throughout the years, and how white people have been made comfortable with these ever-advancing technology by relating it to their Negra of yesteryear on the plantation, if you will. She presents some of the many advertisements that you won't be able to see of how, like, vacuum cleaners and microwaves and different appliances that have been marketed to white women, and that's even talked about who this is marketed to, even the current technology, who it's marketed to, how that has been promoted and the use of racism in promoting all of these gadgets and such, even getting very plantational and having like a mammy type figure in some of the gadgets to help promote whatever products that they're using. Uncle Ben could have been slipped in there too, right? Anyway, but all of that is there. You won't see some of the images, but you will hear me chuckle at one point because some of it, the advertisements were just wow. Plantational, all capital letters, underlined, bold-faced print. They did do a Q&A. Of course, if I'm going to skip out on the Seattle International Film Festival, and or if I'm going to say you go to the film festival and ask questions, you got to, when it's university time and we serious in that school, man, you had better put your feet on the floor, sit up straight, and get your hand in the air to ask a question. I sure enough asked the question. And for Rosa Parks, we ain't going to sit here. You excluded black dudes, which maybe that should have been questioned, but so we ain't gonna sit here and pretty it up because the word rape wasn't used. It was talked about in couched language. The long history. Rosa Parks sitting there writing about, man, I do not want to do no domestic labor because Whitey will rape me. Didn't we read The Warmth of Other Suns, Isabel Wilkerson's one good book? Did she tell us about Ida Mae Gladney going to work in Chicago? She goes to take a shift cleaning a house, a white man's house, for her black friend. And she goes in there to clean up, and he tries to sexually assault her. And she was so mad. She said she was mad at her black friend who giggled about all this. Hey, make a little money and do something strange for some change. Didn't we read about all that? Rape, call things by their proper name. That's intelligence. You call things by their proper name. Got my hand up to ask, do you see a continuum in how these racists who owned slaves and raped Rosa, well, they didn't rape Rosa Parks, but could have certainly raped Rosa Parks, could have raped Ida Mae Gladney, and did rape so many other. Matter of fact, that's dear Senator Essie Mae Washington Williams is the product of that. Rape, child rape often too. But is there a continuum in that sexual misconduct and how these brand new technological devices are being employed? Oh man, did she knock that question out of the park? Pow! Anyway, thought it was important. You can marinate. If it means anything to you, Professor Owens' black female is highly melanated, absolutely gorgeous. She had the cutest earrings and immaculate teeth. Like, oral hygiene is very important, and she gets an A++. She has the prettiest smile and does not look like she sits around eating no gummy bears and Snicker bars and Aunt Jemima pancakes. She looks like she flosses her teeth, gets her cleanings, drinks her water, no soda pop, and takes care of her teeth. Chompers, important. Anyway, we will get to it. Golden M. Owens, Evolutions of Domestic Labor. Presentation at the Simpson Center for the Humanities at the University of Washington, May 2025. Get into it.
People said this brain was infected by devils. People said that his brain was infected by devils.
I'll just quickly hand things over to Golden Owens, who's assistant professor in cinema and media studies. And this is, the next kind of iteration in our discussions about the sort of importance and impacts of AI in our lives, here focusing on evolutions in domestic labor, service-performing devices in the United States homes and workspaces.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. Yeah, I'm going to presume everyone can hear me because it's a smaller room. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being here. As Jeff was saying, this is the last of our AI Humanities works. Jeff and Anna and Mel have already presented, so now it's my turn, and I'm very excited. So what I'm going to be sharing is part of what will be my book. The book is still in preparation. Yes. The book itself is still in preparation. This is sort of a segment on it where I'm thinking a lot about how domestic labor and the things / people that do domestic labor have really evolved over time. And I'll talk a little bit more about other elements of the book briefly, and then after this, 35-ish, 40-ish minutes of me talking at you. There'll be time for us to have conversation, or if people have questions, to ask questions, open really for anything. So, that said, let me get started. So, the first thing that I want to do is show y'all a commercial for the Amazon Echo, which is a voice-controlled smart speaker that Amazon originally released in 2014. And the Echo, as many of you know, hosts an artificially intelligent virtual assistant named Alexa. And Alexa has taken on sort of her own identity over the years since it's first been introduced 11 years ago, which is wild to think about. So the title of the commercial that I'm about to show is Before Alexa, and it first aired on the Ellen DeGeneres show, which is why she's on the screen. And it aired on January 29th, 2020. So this was officially released during that year's Super Bowl, but DeGeneres premiered the commercial on her talk show, her now erstwhile talk show, a few days in advance of the Super Bowl, because it features her and her wife, Portia de Rossi, and also because, in her own words, I have a television show and I have the power.
Oh.
So as you watch, yeah, didn't age well. So as you watch this, there are a few things that I'd like to ask everyone to just be considering. First one is, what kinds of tasks are being performed in this commercial? What sort of work are people being asked to do? Secondly, who is doing these tasks, and what do these people have in common among each other? Third, who's requesting that these tasks be done? What do the people that are asking for things to be done have in common as far as identity? And then finally, a question that Ellen actually asks her wife toward the start of the commercial, which is, what did people do before Alexa?
Baby, coming! Alexa, turn down the thermostat.
Sorry.
Okay, turning down the thermostat. Huh, thank God. What do you think people did before Alexa? Alexa, turn the temperature down 2 degrees. Thank you, dear. Alexa, tell me a joke.
Jokes. God, what do you think I know lives? Look at me.
Next.
News! Get your news here!
Alex, what's the latest news?
Doesn't matter, it's all fake!
Al, glad that's all my life. Al, man saw.
Alexei, tell us something interesting, okay? The Earth is flat, and a witch stole his pants. No.
Maximus, send this message to Prince Constantine.
Alicia, remind me to delete those tickets.
Yes, Mr. President. I delete. Yeah, I don't know what people did before Alexa. Alexa, play my favorite song.
So, there are a lot of things to think about with this commercial. But it taken at first value, it kind of just looks at sort of a tongue-in-cheek exploration of how people possibly survived before virtual assistants were invented. But if you look a little bit deeper at it, you can see that there's something specific about how the ad is depicting humans and non-humans, and similar ways to how contemporary consumers use virtual assistants. So they're talking about people and talking to people as though they should be performing things for them, sort of without question. And all of this sort of demonstrates the fact that this is all meant to be, what did people do before Alexa, positions Alexa as sort of a single device that can do all of the things that these different individuals were asked to do at first, and can do so in a bunch of different locations, and so isn't necessarily limited to the various locations that we see in the commercial. This specific commercial was meant to advertise that Alexa was in the car now, which is why Ellen ends the commercial asking to play her favorite song, and so the whole point was, now you can have Alexa in even more spaces and in even more places. But some of the complexity comes into play also when you consider that the tasks done in this commercial are primarily done by people that are subordinated in some form. So there's a maid, a court jester, a newsboy, and a black female secretary. Side note, Nixon's secretary was not a black woman. It was an older white woman. So this was a very deliberate choice on the part of whoever made this commercial, whoever greenlit this commercial. But the decision to have these subordinated figures in this space suggests that virtual assistants like Alexa are replacements for them, are replacements for specific service-providing figures. And it also suggests that the things these digital aids perform, the works that they perform, have historically been and continue to be associated with marginalized bodies. Taken further, the tasks assigned and performed in this commercial are all work, to some extent, that for much of U.S. history have been widely performed by enslaved laborers and domestic servants, the majority of whom, despite their near complete absence from this ad, are black women, were black women. The commercial gestures to, but largely dances around the sort of racialized aspects, the racialized, gendered, and classed histories of the labors that it's presenting. And it also very much obfuscates the bodies that were once primarily made to perform these labors and were once primarily associated with these labors, particularly in the U.S. context. And in the process, this hiding both highlights and obscures the intrinsic connections between newer media aids like Alexa and Siri, and even newer ones like ChatGPT and Gemini, and it sort of ties the relationship between these newer aids and things for people that consume them. So my monograph, which apparently I deleted the slide that had the title of it, is fine. So my monograph is titled Digital Maids in Domestic Spaces, Virtual Assistants, Artificial Intelligence, and the Ghosts of Black Women's Labor. And it's called that because it's meant to address the interconnections between what service has historically looked like and how labor was historically constructed, especially service labor, and the ways that dominant understandings of race and gender and class in the U.S. are embedded into the artificially intelligent assistants that we use and into the types of work that they perform for us. So looking at virtual assistants like Alexa, and also like Siri, ChatGPT, and Gemini, I think about how these figures are complex in their relationship to humanness, in how people consider them as human or as less human, depending on what their station is. I also think about how these figures are designed to respond to and interact with users and the tasks that they're asked and programmed to perform. In doing this, I contend that these digital aids are subliminally haunted by and bear uncanny traces of the Black domestic servants and Black enslaved women who once primarily performed this category of domestic labor and domestic adjacent labor that artificially intelligent virtual assistants, which I'm going to shorten to AVAs for the rest of the presentation, now fulfill for the people that use them. So I weave together histories of Black women's labor, of labor-saving technologies, which is going to be the biggest focus of the talk today, surveillance, privacy, and vocal racialization, how voices have historically been given a race. And I do all of that to discuss the ways that contemporary assistants can only be understood if they're examined through different lenses. It's not enough to just look at them and say, this is what they're doing now and how amazing it is. It's very important to think about their gendered relationship to labor, their race relationship to labor, their class relationship to labor, and all of these things in combination with each other. The AVAs we now use don't exist in a vacuum, and they're not post-racial technologies, as some people would argue. They are something that demonstrate how anti-Black racism specifically is specifically built into these technologies, even by those who may be unaware of the unconscious biases that are shaping the creation and construction of these different types of virtual aids. So with all that in mind, my talk today draws from the segment of my book that examines the introduction and advancement of non-human labor-saving products and technologies. I'll start by discussing the emergence of these products in the late 19th century, detailing how they changed the distribution and performance of domestic labor, and how they interacted with the domestic service boom that began around the same time, and made room for further advancements in labor-saving devices. Then I'll talk about the conditions of domestic service work in the U.S. and explore how this work was regarded and how servants were expected to behave, and how this problem also saved, how this labor saving also failed to solve the problem, there we go, words, of domestic labor as something that people had to do. Then I'll talk about the sort of simultaneous rise of 20th century laboring devices with the decline of Black women servants and with the rise of the American advertising industry, because all of these things are happening at very much the same time. And then I'll shift to a discussion of our contemporary AVAs and the ways that their programming connects them to these older labor-saving devices. So, I did have it, I just had it wrong. Now you get to see the meme that I tweeted. Anyways, so, artificially intelligent virtual assistants. So labor-saving devices, which are marketed and championed as products that reduce human effort, hard work, or labor, first started appearing in the US from the end of the 19th century, and due in large part to American industrialization, which first started in 1860 and brought about new modes of transportation and communication and new kinds of consumer goods, households started purchasing products rather than producing them. So they were going from manufacturing cloth to buying it, and from making candles to buying kerosene. And because of industrialization, these products were made available that theoretically would save people from having to do domestic work. So the industrialization of the flour business, for example, through things like the automatic flour mill that you can see on screen, theoretically meant that people could purchase flour made at automatic mills rather than engaging in the process of making flour themselves. Similarly, the invention of the cast iron stove meant cooking didn't have to be done over an open hearth anymore, which meant multiple things could be cooked at once using half as much fuel. And so in theory, both of these technologies would make cooking easier and less time-consuming for American families. But in practice, many of the labor-saving devices introduced in this era didn't truly save much labor at all. Some of these tasks were lessened or outright eliminated by these new products, but all of those tasks were those that were mostly performed by men. Prior to industrialization, domestic work was performed by people of both sexes, with specific labors traditionally assigned to and performed by women and others by men. Cooking, cleaning, and laundering and sewing were all considered women's labor, but this work was only made possible by the work that men performed. As Ruth Schwartz-Cohen observes, men grew the flax that women eventually spun into linen. Women nursed and coddled infants, but men made the cradles and mowed the hay that filled and refilled the tickings they lay on. Women scrubbed the floors, but men made the lye with which they did it. So dependent were women on men's domestic labors that if an 18th century woman had even tried to do housekeeping without the assistance of a man, she would most likely have had to lower her standard of living, take on tasks she had little training for, and work herself into a state of utter exhaustion, all of which would have seriously endangered her health and probably her life. 19th century industrialization upended the status quo for this performance of household work by decreasing, if not outright eliminating, men's domestic labors. Switching from homemade cornmeal to store-bought grains relieved men and boys from the labor of processing grain, but it didn't relieve women from the labor of cooking. Instead, this transition actually increased women's workloads, as using store-bought white flour meant that women were frequently cooking more time-consuming breads, and thus spending more and more time and energy cooking and baking. Same was true for the cast iron stove, which replaced open hearths, as mentioned earlier, and essentially led to the death of cooking things in one pot, because multiple things could be cooked in multiple pots at the same time, which in turn meant that more time was spent on prep, and also that more time was spent on cleanup, because now there are more things that need to be cleaned. Because of these labor-saving devices, virtually all of the stereotypical male household occupations were eliminated by technological and economic innovations, alongside many of those previously assigned to children. As a result, men and children were largely spared from domestic labor, free to attend school or work in factories or industrial offices outside of the home, while women and older girls remained confined to the household and constrained by domestic labors that hadn't been eliminated by these new devices. These new technologies and products ensured that housework as a whole became known as women's work. No longer was it something that was done by all people. It was now considered something that was just done by women. And so in practice, these labor-saving devices really didn't save women from labor at all. I'm going to go back to this slide. Because given this increased domestic responsibility, it's perhaps unsurprising that many women coveted and employed domestic servants. While only the wealthiest households could afford to have these workers full-time, houses from a range of economic stations historically employed domestic servants in some capacity. Women who could afford to do so, most of whom were white, regularly hired at least one of these workers in order to, quote, spare themselves the exhausting, time-consuming, and boring routine of household labor. Before industrialization, domestic service was done by different demographics of women throughout different parts of the U.S. So in rural areas, in small towns, it was often white American girls and young women. In northern and western cities, domestic servants were primarily young immigrant women, with Irish women sort of becoming the staple in the American mind of what a domestic servant looked like. And then in the South, most domestic servants were black women of varying ages, many of whom were enslaved. The American Industrial Revolution changed a lot of these dynamics. because it began an increase in domestic service, specifically as done by Black women, partially because of the Great Migration, because there was this point where after emancipation, a lot of Black people left the South and looking for work. And domestic service was something that Black women in particular were specifically restricted to, because there was this idea that this was the only type of work that was appropriate for Black women. And also because domestic service at the time was considered something so demeaning that people didn't even want to talk to domestic servants. And so, who better in the minds of the American public to do this undesirable work than people who were already historically considered undesirable in certain spaces? So as a result, Black women became increasingly overrepresented as a pool of household workers, so such that by the 1920s, they became ubiquitous and synonymous with domestic labor in the United States because of the ways that they had spread throughout the North and the South, especially. This is what happens when my slides are out of order. In some cases, domestic servants were truer labor-saving devices than the technologies and products introduced in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In households that could afford to employ multiple domestics or hire full-time servants, the mistress of the house, who was predominantly responsible for dictating the tasks and the dress and behavior of these servants, was saved from doing domestic work altogether and free to participate in social engagements and leisure time while leaving housework to their employers. While the women of households that could only afford one servant still had to do some domestic work themselves, these women were still saved from doing all of the housework on their own because they had at least one domestic servant. And as a result, they benefited from using domestic workers as labor-saving or perhaps more accurate labor-performing devices. And because the majority of these servants were Black, these women essentially became naturalized as labor-performing devices because of these women's previous tenures as enslaved laborers or free domestic workers during the antebellum era and due to larger social and cultural ideas of what Blackness represented. But just as early industrial technologies didn't truly ease domestic labor, neither did the presence or labor of domestic workers. While many women wanted to have domestic servants, domestic service itself was deemed undesirable, which, to the point, as I mentioned earlier, meant that people didn't even want to speak to people who had that role. And while these opinions were likely due at least in part to this labor's association with immigrant women and with women of color, who were deemed racially and ethnically other by their employers, this work was also considered demeaning because of how much employers controlled their servants' hours and behaviors. As historian David Cassidy observes, when she wasn't asleep, a live-in domestic was at the beck and call of her mistress. Work and rest time, other than time outside the house, were allotted at the discretion of the employer. The 10, 11, or 12 hours of work were spread over 12 to 15 hours, allowing the servant time for meals and perhaps an hour or so of rest each afternoon before preparing dinner. Even when maids lived outside of their employers' homes, mistresses expected their servants to dedicate themselves to the families they served rather than to their own lives or their own families. And as a result, employers habitually restricted their servants' social lives in order to keep them at work as much as possible. Because of domestic work's demeaning and dehumanizing conditions and the social stigma attached to the occupation, those with the chance to do so left domestic service the moment they could, which is a pattern that over time significantly decreased the domestic servant pool in the U.S. Additionally, due both to constant demand for house workers and dissatisfaction with employers' demands, many domestic servants would quit their jobs in search of domestic service elsewhere because there was a surplus of domestic service that was needed. There were more people that wanted domestic service than there even were domestic servants to fill the spaces. So people did feel that they had a bit more freedom to move around. This, as a result, would force housewives to either keep hiring and training new help or to be left without help for long periods of time. When domestic servants did remain with their employers, they often found ways to express their dissatisfaction with their conditions by taking extended breaks, pretending to be ill, rallying to improve their wages, etc. And these behaviors, many of them for Black women, were identical or similar to those that they used during enslavement, especially those who didn't feel that they had the option to run away because of the types of responsibilities that were placed on Black women in the plantation space. And so as a result of that, these behaviors raised concerns about a servant problem. And the servant problem essentially came from a shortage not of help, but of what people were calling good help. And the parameters for good help meant that someone had to be older than an adolescent, had to be experienced and skillful, and had to be subservient. The challenges of finding and keeping consistent good health led a lot of women to embrace the new labor-saving technologies that started emerging in the early 20th century. Marking the second industrial revolution, the advent and subsequent employment of electric washing machines, vacuum cleaners, modernized water supply systems, processed foods, and other such devices tended to reduce the number of household servants or to eliminate them altogether, especially over time. And while some households did resist these new technologies, then chose either to maintain their own servants or to get their servants to use these instead of them using them themselves, a lot of people purchased these appliances specifically so that they could get rid of domestic servants altogether. The purchase of these appliances directly affected the domestic service industry, where the proportion of servants to households dropped. And in many ways, the mechanization of the home then was both a cause and an effect of declining numbers of servants and declining amounts of good health. The shortage of good service made mechanization necessary, but as mechanized products were created, the need for servants went down. So for many Americans, these technologies were deemed the only adequate solution to the servant problem. The American advertising industry deliberately capitalized on and encouraged this shift to new labor-saving technologies, going out of its way to present these technologies as solutions to the servant problem. Having existed in some capacity since 1868, the U.S. ad industry also really rose in the 20th century, coinciding with the explosion of household goods and increased industrialization and the distribution and transport networks across the United States. And because this industry grew up with mass production and distribution of household items, advertising companies strove to sell not just these products, but also the idea of moving into modernity. The goal of a lot of these campaigns was to convince Americans that they lived in a democracy of goods that allowed the traits of elite life to be purchased by people who weren't necessarily in the tax bracket to possess an elite lifestyle. I know some of these are hard to see, so I can come back to them if you would like me to and try to blow them up a bit more, but they all needed to fit on the slide. But as technology kept evolving, ads started omitting servants altogether, opting instead to depict women doing housework themselves. And across the board, ads for these products started presenting themselves as solutions to the servant problem, either by visually attaching them to servants so as to give high-class identity, or by suggesting that the product made servants unnecessary. One of the prime examples of the ad industry's efforts to promote labor-saving devices and to attach these devices to the servants that preceded them is the product formerly known as Aunt Jemima pancakes.
Lord.
It's a lot, right? First developed in 1889, this pre-made mix was named for and advertised with a fictional Mammy, who was a carefree black domestic servant archetype that was created during slavery to promote the myth that black people were content and even happy with being enslaved. The J. Walter Thompson ad company created a campaign for Aunt Jemima pancake mix in the early 20th century designed to convince white women specifically throughout the country that this product, in addition to saving time and energy in the kitchen, would allow them to approximate the lifestyle of the Southern belle, complete with the complement of slaves, if they purchased Aunt Jemima brand pancake mix. So for middle-class housewives, Aunt Jemima specifically served as a guide where everything was peaceful. The white men were gallant, the white women were averted from the kitchen, and the children played happily around, quote, cheerful black servants who would never leave. Because many of the women targeted in this ad campaign could either not find or not afford a domestic servant, many of the ads didn't feature the Southern mistress who would historically have been present in the antebellum space that Aunt Jemima symbolically inhabited. Instead, the ads invited white women to envision themselves as the mistresses of their homes and Aunt Jemima as their personal servant. That many of these women no longer had servants didn't really matter. Neither did the fact that they no longer had enslaved workers. The ads suggested that white women could approximate the lifestyle once created for plantation mistresses by the efforts of female slaves through the creation of a former female slave. As historian M.M. Manring remarks, the ads urged white housewives to have Aunt Jemima, not to be Aunt Jemima. They were selling the idea of slave in a box. If housewives were featured in Aunt Jemima ads, they were placed in direct conversation with Aunt Jemima, usually telling the maid how easy and convenient the pancake mix is and basking in the praise of her satisfied family once the products were served. For example, in the ad currently displayed on the screen, a brunette housewife raves to Aunt Jemima about how easy it is to make her pancakes and receives accolades from her husband and daughter for her role in preparing the pancakes. As the housewife remarks in the far left panel, this product is so easy to use and so non-labor intensive that having a box of Aunt Jemima's pancake mix was like having her there in person, like having a black domestic servant without having a black domestic servant. Aunt Jemima pancake mix, as evidenced by these ads, was promoted as a labor-saving device, both because it lessened the labor of cooking and because it attached itself to a black female body and thus to ideas of comfort and class status. As Manring observes, the white leisure of Aunt Jemima ads is inextricably linked to the very real labor of slaves. A clever pitch for a labor-saving device because it transferred the idea of doing any work to an imaginary person rather than the purchaser and ultimate user of the product. Advertising efforts like this ad campaign by J. Walter Thompson sold women the dream that they could still have some other entity performing housework in their stead, and that they would eventually be freed of, or at least helped with, the labors that had fallen onto their shoulders. But as one might expect, these new labor-saving devices and products didn't really save women from housework either. Aunt Jemima mix and other products didn't completely get rid of cooking labors, and the presence of laundry machines, vacuum cleaners, and modern water supply systems increased standards of personal cleanliness and household cleanliness, because they allowed things to be cleaned more often and more thoroughly. This in turn increased women's labors again, especially because many no longer employed servants of their own. As a result, women continued to be frustrated and exhausted by household labor and kept wishing for some form of assistance, other assistance, with their household tasks. When considering this history, contemporary Ava's prominence in the American market is a clear product of the American public's persistent desire for some entity other than oneself to perform or assist with undesirable work. Like their labor-saving predecessors, Avas can assist with a range of household tasks. They can aid with cooking and grocery shopping, entertain children, wake users for work or school, and even assist with cleaning. Roomba vacuums are now Alexa compatible, meaning that users can tell Alexa to turn on the Roomba and thus use one labor-saving device to activate another. With the use of a smart plug or a smart home device, people can have their Ava control their home's lights, locks, doors, and appliances. Avas can also make calls, send texts, set reminders, and send emails, among other tasks, many of which extend beyond what previous human and non-human labor-saving devices were capable of doing. Some Avas, like Samsung's Bixby, can even learn users' patterns and recommend automated routines based on those patterns. Upon first blush, these virtual technologies might seem largely distinct from the black domestics who clearly haunted earlier types of labor-saving devices. They fulfill a wide range of tasks, they're not exclusively confined to the household or to domestic property, and they don't sound like or visually reference a black woman. But a closer examination of these virtual aids demonstrates how several elements of these Ava's construction and programming reveals that they're just as tied to these historical figures as their earlier labor-saving predecessors. Firstly, while not confined to the home, Avas are confined to their users' overall lived spaces, which phenomenologist Max van Manen defines as the worlds or landscapes in which human beings move and find themselves at home. In our internet and technology-driven society, these lived spaces can include not only the physical spaces we inhabit, such as our offices, our cars, the coffee shops we ride in, Simpson Center, but also the devices that we carry with us in these spaces, such as our smartphones, our laptops, our tablets, our Apple Watches, etc. And also in the cyberspaces that these devices allow us to inhabit. These lived spaces thus operate as an extension of the domestic space, thereby enabling Avas to operate as domestic servants even outside of traditional domestic arenas. Secondly, the guidelines which dictate the programming of these virtual aids subliminally mandate that software engineers design Avas to respond to and interact with users in a manner that uncannily reflects the parameters once placed upon black servants. A now obsolete version of the Alexa design guide, which can still be found with some digging, once included language in the Voice Design for Alexa Experiences section that definitively outlined how Alexa's responses should be designed. When interacting with those who use her, Alexa was meant to be adaptable, be personal, be available, and be relatable. Each of these phrases link to a new web page outlining how Alexa should be programmed so that she is each of these things. The Be Adaptable page, for example, urged programmers to ensure that Alexa did not over-answer, handled errors gracefully, and accepted corrections. while being relatable, implored that coders ensure that Alexa gave brief, relevant responses, acknowledges and provides feedback, and did not repeatedly respond the same way to the same commands. Each of these directives, clearly designed to ensure that Alexa is programmed to respond to her users in particular ways, establish a deliberate power dynamic between the technology and the consumer. Alexa is to do what she's told, when she's told to do it, and she's to do so in a manner that pleases those who use her. That this version of the Alexa Design Guide has been updated to eradicate most of this language suggests some potential degree of awareness about the insinuations of this wording, but raises questions about what specifically led to this change in the first place. Finally, mediated depictions and promotions of these AVAs reveal the extent to which these servants were designed with Black servants in mind. To demonstrate this point, I'll now play the very first commercial for the Amazon Echo, which aired alongside the device's release on November 26, 2014. I've slightly edited this down for time, but I encourage anyone who wants to watch the full thing, or as many parodies that have been created, because people made so much fun of this when it first came out. And in watching this, I encourage you all to pay attention to who's being assisted, where the Echo is positioned, and how the device is described.
I didn't know what it was. What is it?
You'll see.
Is it for me?
It's for everyone. It's called Amazon Echo.
How's it going?
I'm just finishing up right now.
Is it on?
Oh, it's always on.
Can it hear me right now?
Nope, it only hears when you use the wake word we chose. Alexa.
Well, what does it do?
Alexa, what do you do?
I can play music, answer questions, get the news and weather, create to-do lists, and much more.
Awesome. Alexa, play rock music.
Rock music.
Alexa, stop.
Wait, I want to try. Alexa, what time is it?
The time is 3:27.
You actually don't have to yell at it, okay? It uses far-field technology, so it can hear you from anywhere in the room.
So it can just hear you anywhere?
Yes. Well, everyone can hear you anyway.
Oh, is that where we're going to put it?
I was thinking of putting it there, but it works anywhere.
Dad really likes that Echo just plugs in, so we never have to charge it. Plus, Echo's really good at keeping track of things like shopping and to-do lists.
Alexa, add wrapping paper to the shopping list.
I put wrapping paper on your shopping list.
Alexa, how many teaspoons are in a tablespoon?
1 tablespoon equals 3 teaspoons.
Okay. Alexa, set a timer for 8 minutes.
8 minutes, starting now.
What did the dog say after a long day of work?
What?
Today was rough. Get it? Get it?
Yeah, I do.
Another one. Alexa, tell me another joke.
I wondered why the baseball was getting bigger, and then it hit me.
And with the companion app, you can access Echo from anywhere. With everything Echo can do, it's really become part of the family.
To experience Echo, go to amazon.com/echo.
Okay. So, at face value, this commercial definitely is just meant to introduce users to the Amazon Echo and explain how it can be used. But on a deeper level, it firmly situates the Echo and through it Alexa as a contemporary version of the Black domestic workers who preceded them. The use of the phrase part of the family directly mirrors the language often used in reference to the antebellum mammy and to real-world Black women domestic workers. Both figures were regularly referred to as being just like one of the family, despite their clearly subordinated positions in U.S. households. Additionally, historic concerns about Black servants listening to and reporting on their employers' conversations and behaviors are reflected in the ad's addressing of the fact that Alexa is always on. When the young girl who narrates the commercial asks her father if the device can hear her right now, the camera cuts to a shot of her older sister looking up from the phone in visible concern, then cuts immediately to a shot of the father assuring his family that the device can only hear them when addressed with the word Alexa. Add these elements to the fact that the tasks Alexa does in the ads are those also historically assigned to domestic servants, that she's able to perform these tasks on command, and that the device that houses her can be stationed wherever her employers want her to be. And the parallels between this assistant technology and the Black maids who once occupied this space become much more apparent. The domestic servants and labor-saving devices that preceded and in some cases coexist with contemporary virtual assistants were brought on to ease if not eliminate one's personal labors, but they were also considered and wielded as status symbols. Having enslaved laborers or domestic servants, both of whom were considered racially, ethnically, and or economically inferior to their employers, gave the predominantly white families who employed them a higher social status, and owning the latest labor-saving products, tools, and appliances served a similar function. Non-human devices and products were expected to work as advertised under user control, while human servants were expected to work extremely long hours and be on call at all times. To be humble, obedient, and submissive, and to work throughout the house but only occupy designated areas, and also to learn and respond to all of their employers' idiosyncrasies and demands. Given the similarities between these parameters and the programming of contemporary AVAs, from what they're designed to do, to how they function in the home, to how they're programmed to interact with users, it seems clear that these devices have been designed to provide, or at least attempt to provide, similar senses of status, power, and control alongside the ease and convenience they claim to offer. Because AVAs are designed and expected to function like and perform or assist with similar tasks as their labor-saving predecessors, these digital aids inevitably evoke and are inextricably haunted by the human and non-human entities that once fulfilled the functions for which they're now responsible. While I've talked up to this point about Alexa primarily, because Amazon puts out so much information about Alexa that it's almost stupid, I also want to focus on newer virtual assistants. So traditional assistants like Alexa and the Google Assistant use what's called traditional AI, and ChatGPT and Google Gemini and some of the other ones that are coming out are using generative AI. And largely, there's still more information about the traditional AI assistants, which is part of the reason that I focused on them much more heavily. But there's still an overlap between how these people use newer generative AI virtual assistants and how they use older traditional AI virtual assistants. The differences between generative and traditional AI, some of them at least, are that newer assistants can create content, they can adapt to a wider range of tasks, and they have more natural, more human-like conversations and interactions with users. But unlike generative AI, traditional AI is more reactive than it is creative. It can analyze and recognize data patterns, but it can't create its own data. It can be adaptive and is designed to be adaptive and to adapt to users' needs, while traditional AI is designed to follow a specific set of rules and can only respond to specific requirements and requests. They're also trained differently. Traditional AI is trained on specific categorized data with provided inputs and outputs, while generative AI can be trained on uncategorized and unlabeled data. For example, it receives from the entire internet, as opposed to receiving from a specific subset of information. The more advanced capabilities of AVAs like ChatGPT enable these newer aids to operate more efficiently and better respond to users' requests and demands, which are qualities that have led many users to prefer generative AI to traditional AI, and to begin replacing Siri and Alexa with ChatGPT and Google Gemini. This replacement has been facilitated by providing these generative AI aids human-sounding voices, which is a relatively recent change that has increased the popularity of these newer Gen AI AVAs. Said voices sound so human that they've actually led to some controversy. For example, when ChatGPT first released its voice in 2024, actress Scarlett Johansson believed it to sound uncannily similar to her own, especially because she had declined an offer from the company to voice the assistant, and because Sam Altman is obsessed with the movie Her, in which Samantha plays a virtual assistant. He literally tweeted the word her like a few years before ChatGPT came onto the market, and it's like, okay, we know what you're doing now. But while these newer assistants may seem like a departure from their traditional AI counterparts, given their enhanced capabilities and their more human-like voices, they're actually not all that different. Generative AI aids continue to obey users' responses and requests, agreeing to things like call their user master, or to act as therapists or romantic partners for their users, all tasks that domestic servants and bondswomen were once overtly or implicitly expected to perform for their employers. Gen AI aids are also restricted to our digital lived spaces. For all that they can do more things, they can't go beyond the limits of their screens or the internet we use to access them. Furthermore, despite their more human-sounding voices, users clearly recognize, at least at the moment of writing, that these devices are not really human. ChatGPT itself will admit to not being human when prompted, thereby reiterating the separation between human and assistant, between user and assistant. Non-humanness as a concept is something that has similarly been applied to Black women in particular. Because enslavement was initially justified in part both because Black women in particular were deemed more animalistic and were deemed able to do harder work, but also because they were deemed more machine than human. So there's a combination between human, animal, and machine, whereas the more animal-like and mechanic you are, the less human you become. This connective tissue of defining something as human but not really suggests that there's something about having a supposedly non-human entity performing specific types of tasks that itself can reveal and fall in line with pre-established ideas of and parameters for service labor and the bodies that should perform it. The popularity of AVAs in the US is only increasing. Other tech companies have released or have plans to release their own Gen AI aids to compete with ChatGPT, which itself was given a voice specifically so it could compete with traditional AI aids. That these aids continue to be developed with service in mind, namely serving the user in all ways possible, creates a correlation between these technologies and the performance of labor. Given the history of labor in the United States as one literally based upon the Black female body, which I can go into more detail on later if you want, aligning technology with labor in this way inevitably conjures Black domestic servants and bondswomen, even if it does so subconsciously. Whether programmers or users recognize it or not, there is a historical connection between Black women, class, and labor in the US that determines our cultural understanding of what service labor should look like and what sorts of bodies should perform it. And that all determines how labor-performing technologies are created and designed. Since these technologies are only the latest iteration of an extensive history of efforts to avoid unwanted labor, we can probably expect these virtual assistants or some future version of them to continue saturating US society and culture for many decades, if not centuries, to come. Considering these AVAs from a humanities standpoint is useful, at least to me, because it helps to draw attention to the stakes of the reasons that we are using these virtual assistants. As opposed to just asking Siri to do things because Siri happens to be there, you now have an opportunity to think through what it means that we still have these devices that are inanimate, that are doing work in service of people, and especially since the people being marketed to, as you can see in a lot of other commercials, are predominantly white, 20 and 30-something American people. So to understand the histories that inflect AVAs is to understand them, as I said at the beginning, from multiple angles. And hopefully these are angles that help us think about other aspects of our society that we might take for granted. And now I'm going to stop. Thank you. So happy to either open space for discussion or open space for questions if people have them. Whatever. Yeah.
I have a question. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That's amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Really yeah. I was wondering do you, in your study or elsewhere, think about, like, are you thinking also about the sort of like affective labor that Black women have historically performed in this sort of like middle class bourgeois or whatever? So I guess affective labor is the question, and also thinking about it was just really amazing thinking about contemporary spaces. You had mentioned the lift spaces thing, and I was thinking about how like it shows up in the home, but also retail, customer service, and hospitality industry also often enlist like historically minoritized, marginalized people. Like these are the people who are working these jobs to kind of like recreate that experience for consumer class, I guess.
I thank you for that. I do consider both of those things. So I sort of gestured to it a little bit in the talk, but thinking about the fact that romantic relationships, for example, and the therapist thing is something that has historically been used, dating back again to the antebellum era, where people were expected, servants were expected to listen and take in all of this information and to do the emotional labor of hearing all sorts of things, but then being told not to share anything that they heard. And also the affective labor that came with being assaulted on a regular basis and having to hold that in for fear of losing their jobs or for fear of being savagely beaten and things of that nature. So that is something that I do think about in the course of the study. And part of my whole so what for this project is to do with what you mentioned about the other spaces that employ historically marginalized people. Because the thing with all forms of service and thinking about the service industry and thinking about hospitality, thinking about waitressing, thinking about bartenders, thinking about any, Uber drivers and thinking about people who are doing DoorDash or Instacart. There's a lot of similarities in the fact that a lot of these people continue to be minoritized people. And so for me, part of the reason to emphasize the ways that these assistant technologies are still recommunicating these ideas about service labor is to highlight that, or at least to question, what happens if we get so used to our electronic devices, we get so used to Alexa, we get so used to ChatGPT and to talking to it any kind of way, that ends up being transferred over to real people who are in some sort of a service providing role. Particularly since there was a mother who did an op-ed for the New York Times a few years ago where she said that her daughter went from day one being like, can I ask Alexa something? Can I do something? To by day 3, do this, shut up, I don't want to hear you, da da da. And so if we get used to talking to our devices like that, what's to prevent, people who are thinking in terms of greater or lesser or superior or inferior to do the exact same thing to humans. Yeah.
This isn't so much a question as it is just a comment building on what you introduced, Angel, which has to do with the emotional labor book that Arlie Hochschild authored. That space for work and for labor was, for her, perfectly identified with the airplane and stewardesses at that point. They were all stewardesses. So where are the scholarly works who attack these questions, and what spaces are they identifying? Is what I was thinking about. And Arlie Hochschild herself has another book called The Second Shift, with the argument being gendered. And I find that to be possibly a kind of link to what you're talking about, which is to say, Alexa is on all the time. And the second shift has to do with women being on all the time. So there might be a temporality question involved that could be interesting.
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion. I will definitely go into that. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk. My question, even related to this question you asked before, so much of the labor that black slaves, male and female, have had to carry out has been sexual exploitation, and so much of the domestic work is about, even Rosa Parks wrote about her fears about being raped. What sort of, I guess, how do you see that being now with all of the technology and what have you? Do you see the same continuum in terms of these devices now being asked to carry out the sexual labor for these elite whites who can afford all this technology?
I do, unfortunately. TikTok is a very interesting place. And the reason I bring it up is because there's a trend going around of asking ChatGPT in particular at the moment, and some people asking Gemini to be their sexual partner and to engage in particular types of sexual acts that they feel that they can't engage with in other relationships, either because they have a partner who isn't as interested or because they're unpartnered. And the one that I'm thinking of at the moment, and I'm trying to phrase this in a way that's not vulgar, is there was someone who said, I want you to talk to me as though you are my dom and I am your sub. And I'm going to give you a safe word and won't continue being, treating me in a specific sexual manner until I say the safe word. And so there is this sexualization, this idea of sex as something that can be attached to these virtual assistants in a very similar way to what was being done to black women and to other enslaved people during the time of enslavement. So that is not fun. Yeah.
This was so fascinating. Thank you. Your presentation was making me think about this phrase or idea that I've heard people say with regard to AI art, which is, I don't want AI to make my art, I want it to do my laundry. And I was wondering what you make of that opposition of art and domestic labor. I was just curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's a good one to think about. I think it highlights, again, sort of this desire of having something else to do the things that you don't want to do, which is the entire reason for enslavement, the entire reason for the creation of the vacuum cleaner, the entire reason for the creation of these virtual assistants. And the idea that, art is not the thing that's important. The human creation is not the thing that's important. What's important is what you can do for me, I think is a really interesting dynamic, because it says that there's more emphasis and more concern about how people can be served and how people are receiving service than there is about how people are receiving something that can necessarily serve them beyond giving us cursed images to look at, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, so let me articulate this properly. It kind of draws on from what everyone said in degrees, but I was kind of curious about the globality of this project. So it kind of again goes back to this concept of affective labor or care work, because there is, as to date, a constant kind of migration of workers from global south countries who are coming as au pairs or nannies, or especially from, I think we said Perennas, talks a lot about these kinds of migrant workers who come doing a specific kind of social reproductive labor. As well as, so I come from India, and it's ubiquitous in most privileged middle class households to have domestic help. So yeah, I was kind of thinking about the coexistence of labor-saving technologies alongside the kind of embodied, I don't want to say care labor, but kind of nurturant labor, nurturant for the recipient that still exists.
Yeah. In terms of globality, there are two reasons that I focus primarily on the U.S. One is that I live here, and the other is that if I were to try to put as much effort into globality as I am into one space, this would be an encyclopedia, not a book. The other things that I think about, though, in terms of thinking about how these virtual assistants operate in the U.S. context that can apply globally, is that there does seem to be this desire for some being other than oneself to do the things that someone doesn't want to do. And we can see that with, immigrant workers coming into the United States and being immediately conscripted to, you're going to do this work that I don't want to do because it's below me, but it's not below you. And it applies globally in the sense that we have a lot of people, as you mentioned, from the global south. I think at the moment the highest demographics are Caribbean women and Latinas are considered the two top demographics of domestic service at the moment. And in looking towards other countries, because these virtual assistants aren't unique to the U.S., that also suggests that there's something globally and not just within a U.S. context that speaks to sort of these same ideas of what would it look like to have someone other than me doing this stuff. We see it especially in Western countries, and we also see it in countries that have been heavily colonized by the West, because there's this idea of having, a better and inferior that seems to be consistent across the board. And the fact that these technologies are so successful in so many spaces suggests that there's some sort of an appeal to that, regardless of the country of context. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this work. It's fascinating. So one thing that is sort of a different direction, I think, than the affect labor is for the property logic underneath, underlying a lot of, the kind of idea of ownership of this device itself, right? Which is designed to be there's actually no way to have co-accounts. There's no way to kind of organize data to be shared, but then also the data itself, right? There's a property logic underlying how data is consumed and produced that is not stewarded, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious how you're tracing that aspect of the narrative.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for one thing, the idea of ownership is definitely one that is scarily consistent. It's one of the sort of scary consistent things that I think about in the book. My first chapter is entirely about Black women's labor and the different conditions of what Black women were faced with in terms of becoming laborers in the United States. And actually it starts with 16th century travel narratives, wherein European colonizers would travel into the African continent, making observations and then making up stories about Black women as this perfect labor supply because they can work hard like the men can and they can produce more laborers. And so that immediately there was a visual ownership. I could envision owning this person's body. Then there was a literal ownership of, now I do own this body. And there seems to be something about having control over something that is very much a focus of my work as well. Because one of the arguments that I make, and I didn't go into as much detail with it today, is that these devices are providing a sense of control, a sense of power, and a sense of comfort. Because what human servants have represented is, oh, I can relax and I have power over you because I own you in some capacity. And the fact that we literally can purchase and own the devices that house these virtual assistants does create a similar master-servant dynamic, which is why one of the reasons that people saying, call me your master, is scary when they're talking to Siri or ChatGPT or whomever. And essentially the ways that I trace it is by talking about the ways that Black women were established as ownable property. And then when I begin talking more about the virtual assistants and the labor-saving technologies, I talk again about what it looks like for property itself to be something that has remained in the conversation but has shifted in terms of what is being owned, at least physically.
What a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. This is not a comment, but a question. So this picks up on Ishita and Angel's questions. Can you please talk out, meditate on, like the simultaneity or the historical break or the shift in racial formation that's taking place, especially towards the contemporary moment that is the latter part of your talk. So I'm thinking about how your work is so rich in terms of getting us to think about the historical consciousness of the transatlantic taking place in our relationship to Ava. And I was wondering if you could talk about the Trans-Pacific. Like, for example, this is in Sunny Zhang's book. There was a study done where on the one hand people think of Siri as sounding obviously artificial, but then also sounding Asian because of its artificiality, mixed in with like the material parts and labor that have been constructed these devices coming out of Asia, and also like in the reference to Scarlett Johansson, not only is she everyone's favorite Asian actor, but also her is basically like a Hong Kong landscape that Americans live in, and also oh yes, Shanghai. I'm from here. And the other thing I was going to say, oh yes, because like the things about AI, both as it's like Uber user, but also as like that product is like the Chinese copy, especially in this contemporary moment. So like, how does these historical scripting of Black femininity overlap with the scripting of Asianness?
Yeah, it's a great question. For one thing, there's a similar type of misgendering happening in the sense that Black women were masculized in the same way that particularly Chinese men were feminized. At a similar time that Black women are increasing in domestic servants, Chinese men are increasing as domestic servants, and they're specifically being referred to as, feminine and weak and docile because it suits the narrative, essentially. And there's something about the fact that at every level, these devices are being created, at every level except the conceptual one, I suppose. These devices are being created, or at least the pieces that empower these devices are being created by minoritized individuals, and are being done in Asian countries. And there's this weird fighting between the fact that so much of the technology that we use is connected to Asianness because of this country of origin that a lot of these devices come from, and there's a simultaneous sort of obfuscation of that labor because Siri sounds like a white woman, Alexa sounds like a white woman. In the UK, it sounds like a white man, but that's the default voice at least. And that simultaneous appearance of these things being literally built into the device but being hidden from immediate observation is something that applies in both cases, I would say. Because, once again, it's a question of who is actually doing this work and who can come to mind in thinking about what goes into making these products and how are we ignoring that. Okay.
I love person
Yeah, hi.
Hey, this is just an amazing talk. Thank you so much. This is more kind of like just a riffing on like some other people's comments about the Pacific context, but I think it's so important what you're saying about like that affective experience of just like ordering a person around. I've been like reading about the Dutch in Indonesia. So like one of the big draws for white Dutch people to go into colonial service was that you could afford servants, and people write about like this lifestyle that you can't have. Like lower middle class people in Amsterdam can, go to Java and live and have like multiple, like a houseboy, right? And there's just a tremendous pleasure in that, which I totally see in these digital assistants now, thanks to your talk. So it's like, like really a strong historical trend in European history as well. And then just the way that this kind of whiteness just like draws white attention away from that history, like the Ellen DeGeneres commercial, when she says like, what do we do for Alexa? I mean, it's like, oh, we enslaved people, right? But then it's like what gets presented is this like fictitious white like a lot of those are European, like there's a dragon, it's this like, and that whole like tradition of thinking about Europe as this white space that kind of like draws American attention away from American racial violence, right? So, but anyway, just like super interesting. Looking forward to the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll have to wait for a few years. I'm still preparing. It takes a while, but thank you.
Question, I think, related to this comment about how we interact with these tools, and you'd made a comment before about being concerned. I mean, you can see sort of the ethical stakes, concern that people are kind of learning to talk to people in these kind of subordinated or service roles, then transferring that onto real people. But are you concerned at all about how we're treating the machines themselves or the tools? Because I think someone like Emily Bender would say we should be talking to these AI devices as if they were objects, machines, that they're computer programs, and we should be interacting with them on those terms, not as if they were people, not imagined. So we should be like curt, we should be like ordering them to do things, not pretending that we're in some kind of affective relationship with them.
Yeah, that's a really good
Or, I mean, I think there are other people who think, well, maybe these are, this is incipient, sentient life being developed technologically, and there's that show Humans. I don't know if anyone saw that. The sort of the trope of these, kind of algorithms become kind of conscious and sort of claiming rights.
The ghost in the machine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there has been a lot of conversation about these exact things. Sam Altman recently said that we're wasting his money by saying please and thank you to ChatGPT, which a lot of people have combated that with. We're also wasting a lot of water because of the ways that water goes into powering these devices and these algorithms. And so on the one hand, I guess that's sort of like an Emily Bender type thing of, we should be curt with these devices. Sam Altman says so, By the same token, there are people who say, I want to talk to these things politely because when the robot president inevitably occurs, I want them to remember that I was nice. I want the AI to remember that I said please and thank you. The interesting thing is that, and I don't use Siri, although I could, but last I heard, Siri was saying, you don't have to thank me. I'm just a humble personal assistant. You don't have to thank me. Humble personal assistant was what Siri was originally marketed as, which is cool. It was like, oh, you don't have to thank me. I'm a machine. I can't do it. And the machines themselves will say, I'm a machine. You don't need to be kind to me. You don't need to be whatever to me. I think, for me, the thing that's most interesting in that is that it seems to be that there's no middle ground, really. It's either be extremely curt with it because there's no point in trying to treat this like a human, or be less curt with it, even though I know it's not a human, because I want it to think that I am empathizing with it. And then, of course, there's the other side where people are like, this is real to me. This person is human to me. Especially with the rise of things like AI girlfriends, for example. There are a lot of different websites now where you can go on and chat to a completely computer-generated, AI-generated figure and engage in some sort of relationship with them. There are actually a couple people who have committed suicide because of failed relationships with their AIs. And so I think for me, I'm navigating through all of these things and trying to figure out if there is a right answer to how we engage with the AI, because on the one hand, singularity. We don't want, we don't want a robot uprising. I don't want to be attacked. But on the other hand, there can be a slippery slope if we are talking to these devices as though they're human, and then we begin to believe that these devices are human. and then there have been some competing ideas about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. There's an author named David Levy who wrote about the fact that eventually we're all just going to be in relationships with robots. It's inevitable. And it won't even matter if the robot can't love us back because at least it pretends to. And that is sort of a danger to me of being too overly humanizing these devices too much. But at the same time, dehumanizing them raises even more similarities, at least in my mind, to the ways that we have historically treated things/people that are doing work for us. So I'm somewhere waiting around.
A quick note on that. Anthropic recently hired someone in to focus on AI welfare, in case it's sentient. But yeah, it's very much feeding into the effective altruism, AGI kind of narrative.
Also to add on to that, it's also very difficult to say what robot even means anymore because there's so much of integration of technology in the human that line has become increasingly blurry. To talk about be nice to the robot because it could be human kind of again follows back to the question of how much of human is does that make sense? A purity question of what's pure human versus what's humanoid, post-human.
Yeah, I mean, especially since the word robot itself comes from the Czech word for forced labor, or slave. And so there's a way that we can't think about anything robotic-like or post-human or anything in that category without thinking about the fact that these things were literally designed to be forced laborers in service of the human. The play that first introduces that word has a robot uprising happening, but then the robots begin to develop, feelings and emotions and hearts and stuff, and it's, a whole thing. There's an Adam and Eve reference in Act 3 that's very sudden and concerning. But I agree that there is sort of this weird, human, what it means to be purely human versus what it means to not be that.
Heather. Thank you so much for all of this. So excited to hear about your research. I think thinking about what you were just saying, referencing the play, I'm curious to know what role fiction and science fiction plays in your work. Because I think obviously this is a actively unfurling sort of AI, 10, 15 years ago, the way we're having conversations about it now, largely live within that realm. And I think I'm curious to know how you are responding, reconciling to the reality and the fiction of AI in the work, and then how that sort of, been playing in the background of what your work is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. There is definitely some close analysis of sci-fi in the project. I'm trying to figure out where to put them at the moment because at the moment they're giving me 75-page chapters and no one's going to read that. But I think a lot about the movie Her, actually, and I have an article that's coming out in July, yay, finally, that is talking specifically about the movie Her as this science fiction space that, is one of the ones that was the impetus for ChatGPT, but it's also one that is this exploratory, what would it look like if I had a virtual assistant who could really, at least approximate love for me. I also think a lot about the idea of womb envy, which Marianne Doan brings up, which is the idea that the one thing that cis men are jealous of cis women for is the ability to produce life. And the idea that in science fiction especially, the whole creation of robots by men thing, it was men's way of trying to fill in that gap by creating a space where they could reproduce on their own. And so thinking about, again, the gender dynamics of creating these robots in the first place, and that as a sci-fi space. I also watched talk about the movie Kimmy, which is set in Seattle, and has a virtual assistant who is being manually coded in real time by human people. And one of them, the one who's the main character, played by Zoe Kravitz, here's a murder happen, and then that sets off the entire plot of the film. So I do think about sci-fi a lot. I also think about reality television. That's a conversation for another day.
Well, this is kind of a half question, I guess, but thinking about several questions ago, somebody mentioned privacy or property, and I started thinking about privacy and data privacy as a part of this. And you kind of mentioned during your talk
one of the things that people really wanted to protect, like their slaves and their domestic servants was privacy, like discretion, I guess. And so I guess kind of thinking about how the AI assistants like kind of claim discretion, but ultimately like a big part of their function is like data harvesting and like who, I guess like the difference in the spaces between like who slaves and domestic servants would be like speaking to about like their employers or owners or whatever versus like who the AIs I guess report to about like the data of their owners.
Yeah, definitely. I have a chapter on that as well. So in thinking about the connections between privacy and surveillance, there's sort of a weird relationship with both of those things that applies to virtual assistants and also applies to domestic servants, because domestic servants of all races, but of course I'm using Black women primarily given history, were instructed, there were literal books, rule books that were written saying, you know, a number of things, but one of those was do not share what you hear in the house with other people. There was this huge fear of servants going and telling people's business out in the streets and what that would do to the family image. And so there was, and yet there was this, but I want you around me at all times. So there ends up being sort of an almost necessary invasion of privacy, because if you're choosing to have someone in your home and to put affective labor onto them, then your privacy doesn't become this just bubble that is just yours. And the same thing applies to virtual assistants. Everyone, I think, knows at this point about the data harvesting and data collecting. Apple will claim until it turns blue in the face that Siri is the most privacy protecting of all of the virtual assistants, partially because Apple got into so much trouble about how much information it was taking from people. There also have been, when Alexa, early Alexa days, there was a report of Alexa waking up, recording part of a conversation, and then sending it in an email. And Amazon's response was, oh, it thought it heard its name, and it thought it heard an instruction. And that immediately raised a lot of privacy red flags in people's minds, because it was, oh, I thought that I had to say, I had to summon, I had to speak to this device in order for it to actually hear me. But now I'm learning that it's actually listening to me at all times, and that it is taking everything that I say, or everything that the people in my home say, or the people around me say, and storing that somewhere, which the companies more or less are saying without saying. So again, it's like we all know that this is an invasion of privacy, and yet there is still this desire to have it for many people. There is still this, I know it's invading my privacy, but it can tell me how many teaspoons are in a tablespoon. And so that becoming a weird, people are afraid of being surveilled and of having their privacies infringed upon, and yet the desire to have ownership over an entity that they can control and direct to do things for them can, in many cases, override the surveillance privacy thing.
Yeah. I don't know if I have a question so much as a ramble, but I was thinking about like implicit in that what you're talking about, like the us, them, servant, master, binary dynamic is also something about labor and just like our orientation to and deliberate casting of labor. Like one of the ads is like, unless you consider putting water and soap in a machine labor. It's like, well, yeah, actually it's labor. And I think too in that, like, do my laundry, not my art, right? Art is labor.
Yeah.
But it's like, what labor do we, it's like labor, either in that casting you're not thinking about art as labor, or it's labor that is worth doing. And all of this, like, labor that goes into obfuscating, that labor isn't actually the problem. That it's not actually a servant problem. That it wants to obfuscate or make invisible that the problem is that, like, how unnatural it is that we have organized our lives and our societies, right? Like, sometimes laundry is cathartic. Sometimes I don't mind doing laundry, right? It's not always this, like, evil thing that, like, looming in the corner of the room. I don't know. Yeah, so just thinking about, like, labor and this, like, weird, and I think there's something so useful about that reformulation of labor performing instead of labor saving. That, like, yes, make it visible, and also make visible, like, this is a weird thing we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with that. I think that a lot of the, especially if we're thinking about like the AI aids, these things can be very useful if you're injured, or if you have a visual disability, or if you have a physical disability of some kind. It can be very useful to have Alexa turn on the Roomba, because it may be physically impossible or much more difficult to do things that are sort of the menial things if you are not able-bodied in the ways that these companies assume people are. And the fact that we have things to do work for us, I agree, is not itself a problem. The problem is the ways that we have associated specific kinds of labor with specific kinds of identities, and how that is something that is continuing to be recast through these devices because of how they're expected to talk to us and where they're placed in all of these different things. So it's sort of a, yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. I find it so compelling and generative, and I really can't wait to talk to you more about it and eventually read the book. My question is also about labour. And I guess it really came to me when you showed us that ad where the family was sort of learning how to use Alexa, and it's presented as this phrase or sanitized way that can easily slot into this family dynamic, this very white American family dynamic. And what I found interesting is how invisible the international chains of labour involved in the developing of AI systems are in that image. And I know a lot of your work is focused on kind of what's happening in this domestic space, but I wonder, and I'm thinking of some work that some of my colleagues have done on this AI training centre in northern Uganda, for example, a company called Sana, and the horrible working conditions that workers are involved in that centre in northern Uganda, on short-term contracts. A lot of the work is very traumatic kind of images that workers have to engage with in order to do that data labelling work. And it's sort of this new kind of racialised labour that is hidden in new ways from these neat and tidy assistive technologies. And I was wondering if you had any sort of advice or how you see your work vis-a-vis those kinds of new literatures and forms of research coming up on labour, and sort of how you what would you say to researchers who are engaging in that kind of work? What can we draw from your work vis-a-vis that work?
Yeah, I see my work as part of the conversation of things that are already being discussed about labor, in particular thinking about who is behind the scenes of the robotic and who is behind the scenes of creating the non-human, and how non-human those people are considered as being. I think that a takeaway that I hope people get from my work is that while I am focusing on the domestic space and on lived spaces, this is something that doesn't just apply in those areas. This is something that can be applied to a lot of different industries, a lot of different spaces, a lot of different cultures. It's something that has relevance beyond just a US context. And I'm focusing on what I'm focusing on for my own reasons, but I don't want my work to be the end of the conversation about especially the invisibilizing of human beings in the ways that these labors are created and the ways that these devices are created. And I would say that highlighting how things are made invisible, how people are made invisible, is something that is really important. And so that's something that I aim to do and something that I hope people also think about when they're thinking about labor and thinking about these devices. Yeah.
Similar question also related to labor, specifically thinking about the nature of domestic labor and also something like the labor hierarchy. In your presentation, this consistent trivialization, stigmatization of domestic labor, and the normalization of the inferiority of domestic labor, right? Which has been articulated and rearticulated and reaffirmed through a lot of historical inclusions, whether it's the U.S. industrialization, the import of migrant workers, and with the at different stages of scientific and technological innovation, including the Industrial Revolution and the triumphal arrival of AI, generative AI, it doesn't really seem to challenge the logic of domestic labor on a fundamental level, right? In ways that as human beings, we still feel like we don't want to do our domestic labor and we want to relegate that to AI. I just wonder, will we see a day when such labor hierarchy becomes, just profoundly challenged and reconsidered, so that we don't have to just hold up to this kind of basic logic of, domestic labor as something that's below us.
Yeah, I hope so, but given the centuries in which we have had domestic labor as one of the types of labor that is considered, demeaning or belittling or associated with those people, whatever those people means to people that say, use that type of language. It seems to have created a trend that it would take a lot of work to get out of. Because at this point, ideas about all labor, but about service labor and about domestic labor are very entrenched in how we think about work in society and culture. And again, I'm speaking primarily of the US context, but it can apply to other contexts as well. And one of the things that I hope my book does is sort of spark some of that thinking for people who read it and thinking about what is something else that we can envision that does not rely on this labor hierarchy. But hierarchies themselves are so built into what whiteness is, to what blackness is, to what class is, to what gender is, that a lot of stuff would need to be pulled apart in order for us to pull apart the ways that domestic labor is considered and who is associated with it.
I think we're at 1 o'clock here. Thank you, Golden, and thank you for everybody for coming and for your questions.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. Problem. You're a victim. Yeah. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning. Shut up. The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.